The Cement Garden by Ian McEwan, read by Julian Rhind-Tutt. 1. I did not kill my father, but I sometimes felt I had helped him on his way. And but for the fact that it coincided with a landmark in my own physical growth, his death seemed insignificant compared with what followed. My sisters and I talked about him the week after he died, and Sue certainly cried when the ambulance men tucked him up in a bright red blanket and carried him away. He was a frail, irascible, obsessive man, with yellowish hands and face. I'm only including the little story of his death to explain how my sisters and I came to have such a large quantity of cement at our disposal. In the early summer of my 14th year, a lorry pulled up outside our house. I was sitting on the front step rereading a comic. The driver and another man came towards me. They were covered in a fine, pale dust, which gave their faces a ghostly look. They were both whistling shrilly, completely different tunes. I stood up and held the comic out of sight. I wished I'd been reading the racing page of my father's paper or the football results. "Cement," one of them said. I hooked my thumbs into my pockets, moved my weight onto one foot, and narrowed my eyes a little. I wanted to say something terse and appropriate, but I was not sure I'd heard them right. I left it too long, for the one who had spoken rolled his eyes towards the sky, and with his hands on his hips stared past me at the front door. It opened, and my father stepped out, biting his pipe and holding a clipboard against his hip. "Cement," the man said again, this time with a downward inflection. My father nodded. I folded the comic into my back pocket and followed the three men up the path to the lorry. My father stood on tiptoe to look over the side, took his pipe from his mouth, and nodded again. The man, who had not yet spoken, made a savage chop with his hand, a steel pin flew free, and one side of the lorry fell away with a great noise. The tightly packed paper sacks of cement were arranged 2 deep along the floor of the lorry. My father counted them, looked at his clipboard and said, 15. The 2 men grunted. I liked this kind of talk. I too said to myself, 15. The men took a sack each on their shoulders, and we went back down the path, this time with me in front, followed by my father. Round to one side of the house, he pointed with the wet stem of his pipe at the coal hole. The men heaved their sacks into the cellar and returned to their lorry for more. My father made a mark on the clipboard with a pencil, which dangled from it by a piece of string. He rocked back on his heels, waiting. I leaned against the fence. I did not know what the cement was for, and I did not wish to be placed outside this intense community of work by showing ignorance. I counted the sacks too, and when they were all done, I stood at my father's elbow while he signed the delivery note. Then without a word he returned indoors. That night my parents argued over the bags of cement. My mother, who was a quiet sort of person, was furious. She wanted my father to send the whole lot back. We just finished supper. While my mother talked, my father used a penknife to scrape black shards from the bowl of his pipe onto the food he had barely touched. He knew how to use his pipe against her. She was telling him how little money we had and that Tom would soon be needing new clothes for starting at school. He replaced the pipe between his teeth like a missing section of his own anatomy and interrupted to say that it was out of the question sending the bags back, and that was the end of it. Having seen for myself the lorry and the heavy sacks and the men who had brought them, I sensed he was right. But how self-important and foolish he looked as he took the thing out of his mouth, held by its bowl, and pointed the black stem at my mother. She became angrier, her voice choked with exasperation. Julie, Sue, and I slipped away upstairs to Julie's bedroom and closed the door. The rise and fall of our mother's voice reached us through the floor, but the words themselves were lost. Sue lay on the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?